In the crisp autumn of 1984, the voice of 16-year-old Amelia Hayes was the pride of her small Ohio church. She was the talented choir singer with a bright future. But one October evening after practice, she walked out of the church doors and was never seen again. For 39 years, her disappearance haunted her family, a case with no witnesses, no suspects, and no real leads. The trail went cold, leaving a wound in the heart of the community that never truly healed. It seemed the truth of what happened to Mia Hayes was lost forever. That is, until last year. During the restoration of the church's massive, centuries-old pipe organ, workers found something lodged deep within its complex mechanics, a single tarnished silver locket necklace. And what they found inside would not only solve the 39-year-old mystery of her disappearance, it would unravel a secret far darker than anyone could have imagined, and expose the monster who had been hiding in plain sight all along. Some towns feel like they're sealed under glass, preserved in a time that no longer exists. Havenwood, Ohio, was one of those towns. In the autumn of 1984, it was a postcard of American life, a place of unlocked doors, neighborhood potlucks, and a comforting, small-town faith centered around the towering steeple of St. Jude's Community Church. And on Friday, October 26th, the crisp evening air carried the sound of that faith. It was the voice of Amelia Hayes. At 16, Mia was more than just a girl with a pretty voice. She was a vessel for the town's hopes. In her, they saw a future that reached beyond Havenwood's quiet borders. She dreamed of becoming a music teacher, of filling classrooms with the same joy she felt when a melody locked perfectly into place. Her biggest fan was her 8-year-old sister, Sarah. For Sarah, Mia wasn't a prodigy. She was the center of her small universe. She was the one who could explain long division, who knew how to braid hair just right, and who promised that even monsters under the bed were afraid of lullabies. That afternoon, before leaving for her final rehearsal of the week, Mia had made a promise. She'd found a new piano piece, a simple duet, and she was going to teach it to Sarah when she got home. "You take the high notes, I'll take the low," Mia had said, tapping her sister's nose playfully. "We'll make the whole house sound like a music box." For Sarah, that promise wasn't just about a song, it was the anchor for her evening. It was the certainty that her sister, the brightest part of her day, would be back. At the church, Mr. Finch praised Mia's performance effusively. He was the town's cultural pillar, a man who had taught piano and voice to generations of Havenwood children. His approval was a badge of honor, and Mia accepted it with a shy, grateful smile. He told her she had a gift from God, and that it was his duty to protect it. As the other choir members packed up, chatting and laughing, Mia gathered her sheet music. She waved goodbye, her footsteps echoing lightly in the vast, empty space, and walked out into the descending twilight. She was never seen again. A disappearance doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it creeps in. It's a slow, unfolding dread that starts in the pit of your stomach. For 8-year-old Sarah, it began as simple impatience. It was the feeling of waiting for a promised song. 7:30 p.m. Her mother, Carol, called out from the kitchen, asking if Mia had phoned. "Why, get to be." Question was casual, but it hung in the air. 8:15 p.m. The sky outside the picture window was now a deep, starless black. The first drops of an autumn rain began to tap against the glass. Sarah could hear her mother on the phone in the kitchen, her voice no longer light. The words were clipped, tight with an unnamed tension. "Are you sure? Can you check again?" A child knows. They may not have the words for it, but they can feel the exact moment when the normal world begins to fracture. Sarah saw it in the rigid line of her mother's shoulders. She heard it in the silence that followed the phone call, a silence so heavy it felt like you could touch it. 8:45 p.m. Headlights swept across the living room wall as her father's car pulled into the driveway. When he came inside, shaking the rain from his coat, the usual cheerful greeting was absent. He looked at his wife, and in that single silent glance, a wave of cold panic passed between them. It was a wave that Sarah, standing in the Shadows of the hallway felt as if it had washed over her, too. Her world was suddenly muted. The familiar scent of dinner wasn't there. The warmth of the house felt thin and fragile. The only sounds were the rain against the windows and the hushed, frantic whispers of her parents. "I'll check the church again," her father said, his voice strained. "You call the police?" He tried to smile at her, a broken, terrible attempt at reassurance. Then he was gone, the front door closing with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent house. Sarah walked to the large front window, peering out into the darkness. She watched the red tail lights of her father's car disappear down the rain-slicked street. She pressed her small hand against the cold glass, waiting for the familiar sight of her sister walking up the path, ready to teach her the high notes of a song they would now never play. She waited for the world to feel safe again. She would wait for the rest of her life. The first 24 hours of a missing person case are a storm of frantic, desperate action. The Hayes' home became a command post of strangers in uniforms, their heavy boots tracking mud on the carpets, their questions sharp and methodical. Search parties, composed of neighbors and volunteer firefighters, combed the rain-soaked woods surrounding Havenwood, their flashlights cutting uselessly through the dense, dripping darkness. The town's initial shock curdled into a low hum of gossip and speculation. The theories flew. Had Mia run away? Was there a secret boyfriend? But the police, led by a well-meaning but overworked Detective Miller, seized on a more concrete and ultimately more convenient narrative. A transient, a man with no name and no history, had been seen near the church that Friday. This phantom became the focus of the investigation. All resources were diverted to finding him. A ghost chase that gave the illusion of progress while the real trail grew colder with every passing hour. For Mia's parents, James and Carol, it was a special kind of torture. Their grief was a raw, open wound, and the police investigation felt like a constant, clumsy prodding at it. They answered the same questions again and again, their hope eroding with each fruitless day. And in the midst of this chaos, a figure of stability emerged, Mr. Alistair Finch. He visited the Hayes home often in those first few weeks, bringing casseroles and offering words of comfort. He spoke of Mia with a theatrical, heartbreaking sorrow, calling her the daughter he never had, the most profound talent he had ever witnessed. He sat in their living room drinking their tea, his face a perfect mask of compassion. It was during one of these visits, about a month after Mia vanished, that he made his most insidious move. He turned to a silent, hollow-eyed Sarah, who had barely spoken a word since that night. He suggested, with a gentle, benevolent tone, that he give her piano lessons. Free. Of charge, of course, it would be, he said, a way to keep the music alive in the house, a tribute to Mia's memory. To her grieving parents, it sounded like an act of profound kindness, a way to give their surviving daughter a purpose, a distraction from the oppressive sadness. They agreed. And so, every Tuesday afternoon, the man who murdered Amelia Hayes would sit beside her younger sister, guiding her small hands over the ivory keys, hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, in plain sight. The years that followed were not loud with drama, but heavy with a crushing, monotonous silence. The missing posters of Mia, her smiling high school portrait taped to telephone poles and shop windows, began to fade and peel, their edges bleached by the sun and tattered by the wind. They became a part of the town's landscape, so familiar that people stopped seeing them. The fracture in the Hayes family deepened into a chasm. James and Carol, once a unit, became two islands of grief, orbiting each other but never touching. The shared memories of their daughter were too painful to speak of, so they spoke of nothing at all. Dinners were silent affairs. Eventually, they began sleeping in separate rooms. Sarah grew up in this house of ghosts. At school, she was the girl whose sister disappeared. She was an object of pity and morbid curiosity. She learned to be invisible, to retreat into the quiet, orderly world of books. She spent her adolescence watching other girls go to prom, graduate, and leave Havenwood for college. Milestones her sister was denied. On the day of Mia's high school graduation, her name was not called. There was no empty chair, no moment of silence. The world, it seemed, had already forgotten. But Sarah had not. As a teenager, she began her own quiet investigation. She'd spend hours at the county library, scrolling through years of old newspapers on microfiche, her face illuminated by the ghostly green light. She read every article, every letter to the editor about Mia's case. She went to the police station and requested copies of the case file, a request that was gently but firmly denied. So she built her own file. In a locked box under her bed, she kept every clipping, every note, every photograph. It was a meticulous archive of absence. This ritual was not about hope anymore. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. It was about duty. It was about bearing witness. It was about refusing to let the story of Amelia Hayes end with a question mark. The police had searched the woods for a monster, believing evil was an intruder, something that comes from the outside. They never understood. The monster had a key to the church. The monster knew their names. The monster had sat at their piano, teaching a little girl a song, his hand steady, his heart of blocks of ice. 39 years is a lifetime. It's long enough for hope to die, for memories to soften at the edges, and for a community to bury its ghosts. By 2023, Sarah Hayes was 47 years old. The quiet, watchful child had grown into a quiet, watchful woman. She was the head librarian in Havenwood, her life a fortress of order, built from the Dewey Decimal System and the predictable rhythm of due dates. Her parents were gone, having passed away within years of each other, their bodies finally succumbing to the slow-acting poison of a grief they never conquered. Sarah was now the sole keeper of Mia's memory, a duty she performed in silence within the locked archives of her own mind. The box of clippings remained under her bed, a relic of a former life. St. Jude's Church had aged along with the town, its congregation had dwindled, and the magnificent pipe organ, once the centerpiece of Havenwood's faith, had fallen into disrepair. Its notes soured, its bellows wheezed. Before selling the historic instrument to a collector, the church board hired a small team of specialists to restore it, a final act of respect for the titan that had provided the soundtrack to a century of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. The work was painstaking. The restorers treated the organ like surgeons, carefully dismantling the intricate network of pipes, trackers, and levers that formed its complex anatomy. Deep within the instrument's core lies the wind chest, a dense, maze-like chamber that distributes air to the pipes. It's a space that hadn't seen the light of day since the organ was first built. As one of the craftsmen worked a light into the dusty darkness, something caught his eye. A small, dark shape, wedged unnaturally between two wooden levers of the valve system. He carefully worked it free. It was a necklace, blackened with age, its silver chain tangled and stiff. The call reached Sarah at the library's reference desk. The new pastor of St. Jude's, a young man who knew the story of Amelia Hayes only as a sad local legend, spoke with a hesitant reverence. He said they'd found something while working on the organ, a piece of jewelry, and, given the location, he felt he had to call her. For Sarah, the world tilted. For 4 decades, the past had been a fixed point, a sealed room she never entered. Now, someone had just turned the knob. The drive to the police station was a blur. She felt a terrifying lightness in her chest, a feeling she finally identified as the fluttering of a long, dormant hope. It was painful. Hope, she had learned, was the prelude to devastation. At the station, a young detective who wasn't even born when Mia disappeared presented the necklace to her in a sterile plastic evidence bag. To him, it was a piece of cold case minutia, an administrative task before closing the file for good, but to Sarah it was a lightning bolt. The locket was tarnished almost to black, but she saw it instantly. It wasn't just the heart shape she recognized. It was the clasp. Her grandmother, a jeweler in her youth, had repaired the broken clasp years before Mia's disappearance, fashioning a unique, tiny, hook and eye mechanism unlike any other. This was it. This was Mia's. She told the detective, her voice quiet but unwavering. He nodded politely, still seeing only a piece of tarnished silver. "There's more," Sarah said, leaning forward, her voice gaining a strength she hadn't used in years. "My sister showed me a secret. The locket has a false back. You have to press the hinge and the side at the same time." The detective looked at her, his professional skepticism warring with the sudden, undeniable certainty in her eyes. This wasn't a grieving sister clinging to relics anymore. This was a witness. The discovery of that necklace in such an unlikely place left investigators with more questions than answers. It's incredible how a single item can rewrite history. If you, like me, are fascinated by these mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single twist. Conviction has a voice. It's a quiet frequency that a good detective learns to hear beneath layers of grief and time. Detective Isabella Rossi, a transplant to Havenwood with no ties to its haunted past, heard it in Sarah Hayes's voice. It was enough. The dusty, long-forgotten case file of Amelia Hayes, designation 8492, was officially reopened. The tarnished silver locket was sent to the state's forensic crime lab. In a sterile, brightly lit room, a technician wearing blue latex gloves handled the object with the care of a bomb disposal expert. Following Sarah's decades-old memory, relayed through Detective Rossi, he applied precise pressure to the hinge while gently pushing the side of the locket. There was a faint click, a sound no one had heard in 39 years. The false back, a minuscule piece of silver engineering, swung open, and inside, preserved from the elements in its tiny, dark chamber, was a piece of paper folded into a square no bigger than a fingernail. It was brittle with age. Using tweezers, the technician painstakingly unfolded it under a magnifying lamp. The paper was from a hymnal, and on it, written in the delicate looping script of a teenage girl, was a single name, followed by 5 words. "Alistair. He's not who you think." Detective Rossi delivered the news to Sarah in a small featureless interview room at the station. She laid the high-resolution photograph of the unfolded note on the table between them. For a moment, Sarah just stared at it. The world didn't just tilt this time. It shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. Alistair. The name was not a clue. It was a violation. It was the name of the man who had brought her mother soup after Mia disappeared. The man who had patiently corrected her posture at the piano, his voice always calm, always reassuring. The man who had once told her, with a sad smile, that she had her sister's hands. A lifetime of memories, already scarred by grief, now began to curdle and rot in real time. Every act of kindness from Alistair Finch was replayed in her mind, now revealed as a grotesque and predatory deception. His comforting hand on her shoulder during the memorial service. The Christmas cards he sent every year, without fail. The way he encouraged her to talk about Mia, saying it was important to keep her memory alive. He hadn't been sharing her grief. He had been feeding on it. The horror of it was dizzying. It was the realization that the monster they had all feared, the faceless stranger in the woods, had never existed. The real monster had been inside their house all along. He had accepted their trust, their gratitude, their vulnerability, and used it as a shield. While the whole town looked outward for a villain, he had stood beside them, a wolf in the shepherd's own flock. A cold, hard anger began to form in Sarah's heart, an emotion so foreign it felt like a physical object. It displaced the grief, the fear, the decades of suffocating sadness. The quiet, methodical librarian, the woman who had spent her life archiving the past, suddenly had a new purpose. It was no longer enough to remember. It was no longer enough to bear witness. Detective Rossi asked her a question, her voice pulling Sarah from the wreckage of her thoughts. Sarah looked up, her eyes clear and sharp. The victim's sister was gone. In her place sat the key to solving a 39-year-old murder, her mind now a weapon, every memory a potential clue. The ghost of the past had returned, and this time it was pointing the way. Building a case against a ghost is a meticulous process. With the note from the locket as her foundation, Detective Rossi began the painstaking work of resurrecting a 39-year-old world. She started with Alistair Finch. Now 91 years old and living in a quiet retirement community, he was, on the surface, a model citizen with a spotless record. To challenge that required digging through decades of forgotten files and chasing down memories faded by time. Rossi asked Sarah to do the one thing she had never been able to do, read her sister's diary. For 4 decades, the small leather-bound book with a gold-leaf bird on the cover had sat in the box of Mia's things, a sacred object too painful to touch. Now, with a cold, steady hand, Sarah opened it. The first pages were filled with the normal anxieties and joys of a teenage girl, notes about friends, frustrations with homework, dreams of getting her driver's license. But as she read closer to October of 1984, the tone began to shift. Mia wrote about Mr. Finch. She described how his compliments were becoming too intense, how he would hold her hand for too long when demonstrating a passage on the piano. She wrote that he called her his shining star, and the words, which once made her proud, now made her skin crawl. One entry from a week before she disappeared stood out. Mr. Finch showed me his special place in the church basement today, Mia wrote. It's an old, dusty room he calls his chamber of music. He said it's our secret. It didn't feel special. It felt creepy. I don't want to go back there. While Sarah unearthed the past from her sister's own words, Detective Rossi confronted Alistair Finch directly. The interview took place in the bright, cheerful sunroom of his retirement home. Finch was frail, leaning on a walker, but his eyes were sharp, and his mind was a steel trap. He played the part of a charming, forgetful old man perfectly. He remembered Amelia Hayes, of course, a wonderfully gifted but deeply troubled girl. He claimed. He spoke of her with a wistful sadness, suggesting she was prone to fantasy and had a teenage crush on him that he had gently rebuffed. The note in the locket. He chuckled softly, a dry, rattling sound. Teenage girls have such vivid imaginations, he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. He lied with the frictionless ease of a lifetime of practice, turning Mia's fear into a fiction and her warning into a childish fantasy. He was so convincing, so utterly plausible, that for a fleeting moment a seed of doubt was planted. But Rossi had Sarah's conviction, and now she had Mia's diary. Finch's performance wasn't just a denial, it was an assassination of a dead girl's character. It made Rossi more determined than ever. She redoubled her efforts, re-interviewing every living member of the 1984 church choir and expanding her search to former students of Finch from the 80s and 90s. That's when she found her, a woman in her late 40s named Jessica, who had been Finch's prized piano student a decade after Mia's disappearance. When Rossi first contacted her, Jessica was hesitant, her voice tight, with a fear she hadn't felt in 30 years. She had buried her memories of Mr. Finch, telling herself she was overreacting, that she was lucky he had never crossed a line. But Rossi's questions, and the knowledge that this was for Mia Hayes, unlocked the door. Jessica finally described the special attention she had received, the gifts, the possessiveness, the lingering touches. And then came the aha moment. With a trembling voice, she told Detective Rossi about a secret clubhouse he had in the church's musty basement, a place he called his chamber of music. It was the final critical piece of the puzzle. 2 different girls separated by a decade, telling the same story, describing the same secret place, using the exact same chilling name for it. It was a pattern. It was a signature. It was no longer the word of one imaginative girl against a respected pillar of the community. It was the corroboration Rossi needed to prove that Alistair Finch was a predator who groomed his victims in the shadows. The chase was over. Armed with the diary entries and a new credible witness statement, Detective Isabella Rossi went before a judge. She left the courthouse with a signed search warrant for the home and property of Alistair Finch. The shadows were about to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. The home of Alistair Finch was a museum of a well-respected life. The walls were lined with certificates of appreciation from the town, photographs with former mayors, and plaques honoring his decades of service to the church. For hours, Detective Rossi's team searched for a single crack in this carefully constructed facade. They found nothing. But Rossi kept thinking about the mind of a collector, a narcissist who would need to keep souvenirs of his conquests, not in plain sight, but somewhere close, somewhere he could revisit his triumphs. In his study, behind a row of leather-bound musical encyclopedias, they found it, a small, almost invisible seam in the wood paneling. It was a hidden compartment, and inside was a cedar box. The box was not locked. It was as if he wanted it to be found eventually. Inside lay the secret history of Alistair Finch. There were dozens of small trophies, each in its own plastic bag. A barrette from one girl, a ticket stub from a movie he'd taken another to in 1978, a pressed flower from a third. And then, at the bottom, they found what they were looking for. A faded blue silk ribbon, the same one Sarah had told Rossi that Mia was wearing in her hair on the day she vanished. Beside it lay a small, wallet-sized school photograph of Mia. It was the photo from her mother's bedside table, the one the family had noticed was missing a week after her disappearance. Detective Rossi didn't need a forensics lab to analyze these items. This was proof of possession. This was the monster's treasure chest. She drove back to the retirement home and confronted Finch, placing the open box on the sunroom table in front of him. For a long moment, he simply stared at its contents. The affable charm, the mask of frail confusion he had worn so expertly, dissolved. His face hardened into a mask of pure reptilian rage. The game was over. He knew it. There was no remorseful confession. There was only the bitter, venomous rant of a narcissist whose secrets had been exposed. He began to talk, and as he did, the final brutal truth of what happened on October 26, 1984, finally came to light. The motive was never love or passion. It was ownership. Alistair Finch saw Mia's talent not as her own, but as his creation, her voice, her future. It all belonged to him. In the weeks before her death, Mia had begun to gently pull away. She had talked about a boy she liked at school. She had mentioned applying to a college out of state. To Finch, this was not a normal act of a teenager growing up. It was an intolerable act of betrayal. His perfect creation, his shining star, was threatening to leave his orbit. He could not allow it. That night, after the other choir members had left, he lured her back to the organ loft. He told her he had written a special solo just for her, a piece that would guarantee her a scholarship. It was a lie. He confronted her, his possessiveness turning into a desperate, pleading anger. Mia, frightened, stood up to him. She told him he was scaring her and that she was going to tell her parents. It was then that he snapped. In a fit of narcissistic rage at being rejected, at the thought of his perfect world being exposed, he attacked her. It was clumsy and brutal. In the struggle, her necklace snagged on the organ's complex machinery and broke, falling deep into the instrument's guts. Unseen, after she was gone, a panicked Finch moved her body from the church under the cover of darkness. He had committed the perfect crime, confident that his most crucial mistake lay forever hidden in the heart of the great organ. Detective Rossi called Sarah Hayes. She told her that Alistair Finch had been arrested, that he had confessed. She told her about the box, about the ribbon, about the photograph. For Sarah, there was no feeling of triumph. There was no cathartic release. There was only the sickening, crushing weight of the truth. The abstract monster she had spent a lifetime trying to imagine now had a face, and it was a face that had smiled at her, praised her, and comforted her. The why was the cruelest cut of all. Her sister hadn't died as part of some grand, mysterious evil. She had been murdered for simply wanting to live her own life. With the culprit's confession, the brutal truth finally came to light, proving that perseverance can overcome decades of silence. If stories of justice like this inspire you, leave a like to support our research. The legal end for Alistair Finch was swift and quiet. Faced with irrefutable evidence and his own damning confession, there would be no dramatic trial. He was charged with the murder of Amelia Hayes and remanded to a secure medical prison facility to await sentencing. But justice, in its own way, has a timeline. 3 months after his arrest, before he could be formally sentenced, Finch died of heart failure in his cell. He left the world not with a bang, but with a whimper, a footnote in the story he had so brutally orchestrated. For Sarah Hayes, the news of his death brought no celebration, no sense of victory. It was just an ending, the end of a chapter she had been forced to read for 39 years. The question that had defined her entire existence had been answered. The weight of the unknown was finally lifted, but in its place was the heavy certainty of the truth. She now had to grieve her sister all over again. The first time, she grieved the girl she lost. This time, she grieved the woman Mia never had the chance to become, and she mourned the stolen innocence of her own childhood, which had been spent in the shadow of a monster disguised as a friend. A few weeks later, Sarah drove to the Havenwood Cemetery. For the first time, she stood before Mia's grave, not with questions, but with answers. She spoke to her sister, her voice soft in the quiet air, and told her the whole story. She told her that she had been heard, that she had been believed, and that she was, at last, free. It was a private, heartbreaking, and necessary farewell. In the months that followed, something within Sarah began to shift. She was no longer just the sister of the victim. She was the woman who had clawed the truth out of a 39-year-old silence. She refused to let Alistair Finch have the final word. Mia's legacy would not be one of tragedy. It would be one of music. Sarah sold the family home, the house of ghosts that had held so much pain. With the inheritance, she established the Amelia Hayes Music Scholarship, a foundation dedicated to providing instruments and lessons to underprivileged children in the community. The first recipient was a shy 10-year-old girl with a powerful voice who dreamed of singing, but whose family could never afford a piano. As Sarah watched her play her first notes on a brand-new keyboard, she saw a flicker of her sister's light. The music that had been silenced in the church organ all those years ago was finally playing again, a melody of hope passed on to a new generation. The town of Havenwood had to reckon with its own lost innocence, forced to accept that evil can wear a familiar face. But in Mia's name, a new, stronger harmony began to emerge. The story of Amelia Hayes teaches us that no voice should be silenced forever. Your subscription isn't just a click, it's an echo that amplifies these stories and strengthens our community. Please help this community get louder and stronger. Subscribe, and let us know in the comments from which city you watched this incredible conclusion.